Welcome back. Last time we talked about the mechanisms that caused extreme levels of wealth in the United States, and how these same mechanisms drove down living standards and mental health for ordinary people. Today we'll wrap this series up with an episode focused on how we can fix the policy mistakes of the past 45 years and move toward an economy that works for people across the economic spectrum. Because when wealth pools at the top, the bottom loses stability, opportunity, and dignity, all of which are essential for mental health. The first thing I'll say is that there are a lot of ways to do this. What I'm going to talk about today are some common sense fixes that don't require an entire reimagining of our economic system. Capitalism can work, we just need to put the guardrails back on. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, wrote in The Wealth of Nations, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some other contrivance to raise prices." What he is essentially saying here is that free markets cannot be left unregulated, or else they inevitably become harmful to the public. The only way capitalism works is if the government intervenes to protect the public against monopoly and exploitation. The last episode vividly proved his point and contradicts the predominant ideology of Milton Friedman and the 1980s Chicago School economists. And we need to be honest. For most Americans, the economic foundation has already collapsed. History shows that people will only tolerate this for so long before demanding change. If things break down further, it will affect all of us, regardless of political beliefs or our personal finances. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. The first thing we have to address is the almost complete lack of antitrust enforcement in the US. As we discussed last time, monopolies and oligopolies are harmful because they lead to lower wages, higher prices, and increased wealth concentration. Now, there are laws on the book to stop monopolistic consolidation. These include the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act. But in the 1980s, our government basically stopped enforcing these laws. They decided that the only types of bad monopolies were ones that raised prices. And even then, they let many companies get away with raising prices after they consolidated. Unfortunately, there are now 45 years of legal precedent that would make it difficult to start suddenly enforcing antitrust laws again. Courts now interpret antitrust laws narrowly, only considering price increases, so regulators can't stop harmful consolidation under current precedent. So how do we fix this? Well, Congress can override judicial precedent with statutory clarification. What we need is new legislation that makes explicitly clear that the purpose of antitrust laws are not just to prevent price increases, but also to prevent the loss of small businesses, the weakening of labor markets through monopsony, the decline of innovation, and the concentration of market and political power. So step one is to start enforcing antitrust legislation again. Next, let's talk about wage suppression and worker leverage. We need legislation that stops companies from abusing non-compete clauses and similar methods to prevent workers from negotiating for higher wages. We don't have time to get into all of them, but other practices that need to be restricted or prevented include mandatory arbitration, wage fixing through the use of benchmarking tools, and the misclassification of workers as independent contractors. All these are tools companies use to weaken worker bargaining power. And just as importantly, we need politicians with the ethics and the political willpower to enforce these laws. Now, on to tax policies. The US has some of the most regressive tax policies among countries with advanced economies. That is, the poorest people in the country pay a higher portion of their income in taxes than the wealthiest people. To fix the tax imbalance, we need to raise income taxes at the top, remove the income cap on Social Security taxes, and most importantly, introduce a real wealth tax. Right now, the only real wealth tax that the US has is an inheritance tax, which is collected when a wealthy person dies and transfers their fortune to someone else. However, this tax is basically optional because there's a popular strategy for avoiding it. This is referred to as buy, borrow, die. I'll save the explanation for how this works for another video, but for now just know that it effectively allows very wealthy people to avoid paying the estate tax. It's important to understand that taxing wealth is the single most effective way to reduce wealth concentration. And reducing wealth concentration doesn't just fix economic numbers, it reduces the chronic stress, instability, and hopelessness that fuel the current mental health crisis. It also shifts business incentives from maximizing profits to maintaining stability. If done correctly, it still allows people to be very wealthy, but puts a soft cap on extreme levels of wealth. Thomas Piketty, one of the world's most prominent economists on wealth concentration, has suggested an annual tax on wealth ranging from 2% to 10% or more depending on the size of the fortune. If we did this, and only this, it would go a long way to solving most of the problems we've discussed. About 2/3 of Americans support a wealth tax. However, I'm aware that this one solution is blasphemy in some political circles. My intent here is not to say that one philosophy is wrong and another is right. I'm simply pointing out that unless we implement a wealth tax or find another method to reduce wealth concentration, that living standards will unavoidably continue to fall and rates of mental illness will increase. And while we're here, I wanted to address a common myth about wealth taxes. The myth is that if you raise taxes on wealth, that wealthy people will leave the country to avoid the tax. Economists have a model that predicts how much taxation wealthy people will tolerate before they move their money offshore or relocate to a lower tax jurisdiction. This model was developed by Nobel laureate Peter Diamond and Emmanuel Saez, and it looks at how sensitive high earners are to tax changes. And it turns out they aren't really very sensitive at all. The top marginal income tax rate that maximizes revenue without causing people to move away or hide their money is somewhere around 70 to 80% on the very highest incomes. In other words, wealthy people are not going to pack up and leave, even if the US were to tax them quite a bit more. Next, let's talk about housing. Housing insecurity is one of the strongest predictors of chronic anxiety. And I mentioned before that 45% of the housing supply in the US is owned by the top 10% of the population. This increases competition and drives prices up. We need a way to stop people from speculating so aggressively in the housing market. Economists and housing experts have proposed at least a dozen ideas for how this could be accomplished. For example, we could ban corporate ownership of single-family homes. We could put a tax on vacant units so corporations don't hoard them or charge exorbitant rents. Or we could ban interest-only home loans, which contribute to high prices. There are lots of ideas floating around about this, and personally I'm agnostic about which ones get implemented. I only know that we have to do something to discourage wealthy investors from driving prices up. Of course, if we tax wealth, like I mentioned earlier, you would see a lot of people in that top 10% being forced to liquidate some of their housing stock in order to pay taxes, which would naturally reduce housing prices for everyone else. Next, the minimum wage. I talked about it multiple times before, so you know I'm in favor of raising it. Now, the most common counterpoint whenever someone talks about raising the minimum wage is that it will cause businesses to cut workers and lead to higher unemployment. And there is a legitimate risk of that happening if you raise the minimum wage too much. However, studies have shown that setting the minimum wage to about 45% of the median income for full-time workers has minimal impact on business and unemployment and significantly increases living standards for people at the bottom of the income distribution. And this isn't a radical idea. This used to be normal. The minimum wage used to be 45% of the median income. So all I'm saying is to put it back to where it was. In 2025 dollars, this would be something like $13 an hour. Okay, now we're on to the rules for stock buybacks. As we discussed last time, stock buybacks are a wealth redistribution tool which moves money away from working people and into the hands of wealthy stockholders. Stock buybacks don't improve the company, they just improve stock values. There are a couple ways we can address this. You could just outright ban them. Stock buybacks used to be legal because they were considered to be a form of market manipulation. But if we don't want to make them illegal, we could increase the tax on buybacks from the current rate of 1% to something like 5%. This would make companies pause before doing a buyback because they're essentially choosing to hand money to the IRS rather than invest in workers or productive capacity. Finally, what do we do with the money raised by the wealth tax? Well, once we reduce wealth concentration from the top, the next step is to boost opportunity from the bottom by investing in public goods that make life affordable and social mobility possible. The first way to do this is by investing in family stability. We do this by implementing universal childcare or short of that, some sort of childcare subsidy. These programs do two important things. First, studies show that they significantly improve learning among children who participate. This leads to better marks in school and better career opportunities. Second, they allow parents to continue to participate in the labor market without having to worry about who will watch their kids. Childcare wasn't something we discussed extensively before, but the annual cost is something like $12,000 or so nationally per child, so getting this from the government or getting it subsidized would make a big difference for working families. The second thing we do is invest in housing stability. We could easily make a whole video on why housing costs are so high, but a big part of the problem is that the private sector is not building enough units, which is constraining supply and driving prices up. I recommend that our government build some mixed income housing for public use. And this isn't the projects, okay? This is something nice that can be maintained and that people would be proud to live in. Several other countries such as Finland have already done this and have proven that it can improve living standards without discouraging private construction. The third thing we do is invest in education. This includes free or subsidized tuition at community colleges and state universities. We know that getting a college degree significantly improves lifetime earnings, and that loan debt from college is one of the biggest financial struggles of young adults. This solution kills two birds with one stone. It also improves social mobility for people at the bottom end of the income distribution. The next thing we do is invest in healthcare. We do this by moving to a single-payer public healthcare system. The US has some of the highest healthcare costs in the world, and the cumulative inflation of healthcare is one of the main reasons that young people can't afford to live. Now, this doesn't have to happen overnight, and the cost couldn't be borne by a wealth tax alone. But for now, we could at least increase healthcare subsidies so that they aren't financially crippling. And last but not least, we invest in US infrastructure. A lot of the US infrastructure is 50 or more years old. We need to upgrade things like the electrical grid, water systems, and roads. We also need to expand broadband internet access. This is sort of a New Deal style investment. It builds things that we actually need and employs skilled labor across the country. Taken all together, these changes in policies and investments in public goods would significantly reduce wealth concentration, which, as we have repeatedly said, would improve living standards and reduce rates of mental illness in our communities. So this wraps up our series on how wealth concentration reduces living standards and causes mental health problems. I promise we'll talk more about jail mental health in future videos, okay? But I had to make these first few videos about this because the issue is huge, and I don't hear enough people talking about it, especially in mental health. For those of you who work in mental health, you should care more about this than you do about anything else in our field. Don't get me wrong, therapy matters, medication matters, increasing funding for mental health and access to mental health care matters. But if you care about our collective mental health, then focusing on anything other than our economic and policy situation is like bailing water out of a boat with a hole in the bottom. You can keep people afloat for a while, but unless you repair the hole, the boat is going to fill up faster than you can bail it out. The good news is that we live in a democracy and we can choose to fix this. The challenge is that democracies only work when people understand what's actually happening, and most people don't. So your job, if you call yourself someone who cares about mental health or cares about justice, is to go out and educate other people on these issues and why they're important. You don't have to make YouTube videos, but you can engage yourself in local politics. If you're a student, you can raise these issues in class, or just talk to your friends and family about these issues. If people tell you that you're wrong, have them explain why they think so. Don't make it an argument, make it a discussion. If we spend all our time hating each other, we can't unite around our mutual interests. We all want productive work, a place to live, food to eat, and a reason to be optimistic about the future. This is the foundation we need for young adults, maybe your children, to build mentally healthy lives on. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.